so let's get started here. Feel free to continue, checking in, introducing yourself, and letting us know what you've accomplished over the last few months. Summer's not yet over, so even if you have not yet done what you'd like to do, I'm sure that there's more time to squeeze it in. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you may be joining us from. My name is Avi Stamen, and I'm the CEO of Academic Language Experts. Academic Language Experts, or ALE for short, provides customized editing, grant writing, and publication support services to researchers, scientists, and other professionals to help them produce publication-ready texts at the highest levels. We also assist scholars who are looking for help with their book proposals prior to submission to their dream publisher. It's our mission to help our authors achieve publication success and be a source of guidance and support throughout their journey. Feel free to be in touch with me for more information. Thank you for joining us today for our 20th publication success interview. Yes, you heard that right. Where I engage in conversation with innovative thought leaders in the world of academia about how they are influencing the world of research in the hopes of helping authors better understand the publishing landscape and build bridges between authors, publishers, and funders. Because it's our 20th session, I do want to, before we get started here, give a special shout out to Alana, who is mostly in the background, but really is the driver behind making sure that these sessions work, making sure that they're always run on time, organized fashion, that you get emails with the recordings afterwards. That's really thanks to Alana's hard work. So Alana, take a bow, and well deserved. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jane Friedman, lecturer and author of the book, The Business of Being a Writer. And if you think the title is a little bit edgy and catchy, just wait until you hear her speak. Jane has spent nearly 25 years working in the book publishing industry with a focus on author education and trend reporting. She's the editor of The Hot Sheet, the essential publishing industry newsletter for authors, which was named the 2020 Media Outlet of the Year by Digital Book Award. Jane, if you want to show us your big trophy at any point, feel free to do so. Her latest book is The Business of Being a Writer, which was published by the University of Chicago Press, which received a starred review from the Library Journal. In addition to serving on grant panels for the National Endowment for the Arts and the Creative Work Fund, she works with organizations such as the Authors Guild to bring transparency to the business of publishing, and God only knows how much the publishing industry needs transparency. I mean that entirely seriously. Go ahead and ask your questions on the Zoom chat, and we will try to answer them at the end of the session. If you have a more personal question or want to discuss your specific research, feel free to reach out to Jane or myself privately after the interview. The interview is being recorded, and we will send it out over the next few days. And now, with great excitement and no further ado, I want to introduce you to Jane Friedman, otherwise known as Miss Jane, Wonder Jane, Sweet Jane, Clayton Jane, the other Jane, Not That Jane, and Smiling Jane. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today. It is lovely to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, so I want to jump right in, and I understand that you sort of became interested in the business of writing, which we really want to hear about. I think that's why we're all here today. And that coincided with your work moving from print publishing, or general, the industry moving from print publishing to digital publishing. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of what the industry was like until as you were starting out, maybe, and then maybe any specific moments that led to, this transformation to digital and your thinking about the business of writing.
So when I started in commercial publishing, it was the late 90s, and this was before anyone took Amazon seriously, before there were ebooks, before Kindle. And I stayed with a particular commercial publisher through 2010. And that decade from 2000 to 2010 was a really critical time for publishing, where you saw Amazon and Kindle and all of these things gain power. And it really upended things for both publishers and authors alike, because it opened up more paths to getting your work out there. It exploded the self-publishing market. And as all of this was going on, there was also a lot of consolidation happening in commercial and trade publishing. So one of the interesting things about this period too was that you saw Barnes and Noble become hugely powerful and be really critical to commercial publishing's fortunes. And it also, of course, has an education arm that operates separately from the commercial division. And it also started its decline during that period as Amazon became more powerful. In any event, in my role at the publishing company, I became publisher of a variety of different lines. And, I just kind of saw in real time how these shifts were occurring. It was also when social media started to explode. So there were just so many layers to it, and we could spend a whole hour discussing any one of them.
Got it. And I understand that in sort of maybe, I don't know, in parallel or before or after your work in the publishing industry, you also have kind of had one foot in and out of the world of academia. So can you tell us about, maybe a little bit about your work as an academic, not just as a publishing industry, professional? And do you think, would you say that experience has kind of been to your benefit or maybe to your detriment as your career has evolved?
I think it's been super helpful because at least in the creative writing industry, a good deal of it is university-centric with MFA degrees, and the largest writing conference in the United States is ultimately an academic conference, the AWP. So when I was working in commercial publishing, I was actually getting my master's in English at the same time and working as graduate director of the Writing Center at the university. And I thought I was actually going to go on and get a doctorate and just teach full time. Publishing was almost like a side trip or side hustle, if you could even call it that. But something I did during that time was read the Chronicle of Higher Ed just every morning at the Writing Center, and it actually turned me off to a full-time career. Although I did end up being a professor for a couple of years at the University of Cincinnati, but it was in a very unusual division. It was a division of electronic media at the University of Cincinnati, which was very focused on teaching students skills to succeed in either traditional media like broadcast, TV or radio, Hollywood, or in digital media. So that division too was making a transition, interestingly, that I assisted in. So I like having both the commercial perspective and the academic perspective, because it just gives me a 360-degree view of what's happening. I don't necessarily feel an allegiance to any side of this equation. I can see all of the perspectives, and I try to act as a bridge between them all.
Got it. So in that way, we're very similar. One of the things that I noticed when we were starting to work with academics is how big the chasm is between authors and publishers, and how much they're sort of speaking past each other oftentimes. Yeah. So what led you to kind of take up the mantle or realize that authors really need to understand not only the important messages that they're trying to give over, whether it's in literature or in academia, but actually the business side of being a writer. And maybe you could define for us what you mean by that, and also how you came to kind of make this your, the point that's really driven a lot of your career.
The dividing line for me is, as soon as you want your work to be paid for or published, or you want it to be out on the market, that's essentially when you're encountering the business. Publishers are going to make decisions based on what's happening in the market largely, with some rare exceptions. But publishing has always been unique in that it has to juggle both the art and the business. And for anyone who if you've been paying attention to the news, there's actually an enormous antitrust trial going on where the Department of Justice has tried to stop a significant merger in commercial publishing. And what's come out of that trial is the fact that publishing is both art and business. And actually the publishers look like they're bumbling along, but they just barely make a profit. But anyway, to get back to the point. So one of the reasons I ended up focusing on the business side, part of it was personal or professional, in that I was put into a more senior or executive role where I had to deal with the numbers and the reality of editorial decisions that were affecting the bottom line and how to keep everything sustainable and keep everyone employed. But also looking at the people I was trying to help, writers and authors, I noticed that a lot of people had misunderstandings or incorrect expectations, or they were, living under some sort of mythologies about how writing and publishing works. And it was very harmful. It caused bitterness. It caused people to give up. It caused people to antagonize their editor or publisher or agent. And it's just bad for everyone, when you don't at least have an understanding of why certain decisions are being made. This isn't to defend publishers, though. I mean, publishers, can be very coy, that they're not often transparent. Sometimes I feel like they infantilize authors by withholding information. So that's part of why my mission is to bring transparency to all of this, because I think it helps reduce that bitterness and the misplaced expectations.
Can you give us one or two, sort of classic examples of things, authors, maybe issues that authors would get frustrated by, or that would present like a wall for them that, now that you have this 360-degree view, you can kind of say, okay, it's important to understand, why it is the way it is?
I mean, there's so many. One of the big ones is authors' expectations that the publisher is going to take care of the marketing. And, I feel like that one's been worn away pretty completely at this point. But especially in the early years of my career, a lot of authors just wanted to be hands off, and they thought that the publisher would take care of everything, or that their agent would take care of everything. And every author has to be an active participant in the marketing and promotion. It's not outside your purview. But interestingly, this kind of like dovetails with another kind of myth that I try to push against, which is that the business side can't be creative. I actually think that the act of marketing and promoting a book can be, and often is, a creative act, and it's built on your own strengths and assets. You don't necessarily have to go out of your comfort zone to adequately market and promote a book. It has to be built from the strengths that you already have in your career.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Can you, like, if let's say I'm going to give you a scenario of a scholar who, has been a very serious scholar with good research, is, well connected within their field, but never really took, time to build up a social following of thousands of followers. That's probably a good description of, 90% of the folks that are with us today. What are some of those maybe pockets or marketing, tools that we may have in our tool belt that maybe we're not even aware of, or things that we should be checking to see if it can help us?
Yeah, I think people overlook what's in their own backyard. So you just mentioned this person is well connected. Well, that is probably the number one most useful tool, you might say, in spreading the word about one's book. And a lot of people feel shy or modest or, I don't know, awkward about simply telling people their book exists now, and would you mind supporting it in some way? But this is where I think education about how to do that in a way that's graceful is very useful. So, like, rather than blasting out an email or a LinkedIn message to thousands of people without any personalization, making a very generalized request of support, you instead reach out thoughtfully to individuals and ask one question, or you make one request that you think is reasonable and fits with what they're known for. So, like, I might ask one of my colleagues, would you blurb my book, give us a little endorsement that we can put on the cover? Or I know that you have an email newsletter, or I know that you run this Zoom series, or I know that you run this podcast. Would you consider having me on as a guest, or would you profile my book? So I think once people understand I hesitate to say etiquette, because every relationship is different, but knowing how to make these requests from the relationships that you have, I think it helps make everyone more comfortable about the process of spreading the word. And that's ultimately what it's about, just letting people know that there's a book available. It doesn't require social media. It doesn't require thousands of followers. Obviously, it helps if it's there, but marketing it's not about social media. Social media is just a tool that helps you communicate.
Yeah. I always find it always amazes me, anew every time that when I ask for a favor, but I'm willing to admit that it's a favor. I'm not, pretending like, oh, let's make a deal, but rather I'm being honest and straightforward, can you help me with this? 9 times out of 10, most human beings want to help and they want to be supportive. Yes. So that's a very different thing than saying, can you lay out, $150 to buy it? So you have to be tactful, but sometimes that favor can get you much further than that individual sale that you make. So I think that's a really important kind of way of going about it. Okay, I want to get back to the marketing and element in a minute, but before we get there, I want to read you a few lines that I have heard countless times, and I want you to respond to them and tell me whether you think they're urban legend or truth. So publishing is a dying business. Writers can't make a living off their work, or academic writers can't make a living off their work, and academic books cannot be profitable. These are sort of mantras that I hear a lot from academic authors. There's sort of a baseline expectation, understanding, well, I am here to publish for my colleagues with the understanding that there's little to no chance that this is ever going to get beyond my direct circle of colleagues, and that's just what it is. So really, any time and effort that I put into trying to push it is maybe futile, because I'm in such a small niche, or how many people are really going to care about what I write? So I'm curious to hear your response to that.
Well, the first statement, publishing is a dying business. I mean, last year was publishing's most profitable year in the last 15 years. So it is not dying. Now, the nature of it has shifted, but it's doing exceptionally well. The pandemic was very kind to publishing. Now, I admit I am thinking here about commercial and trade publishing, but generally speaking, everything is going pretty well for all publishers. And then the second, Pete, read me the other two questions.
So sorry, I
or
threw a
the
lot
statements.
Writers can't make, academic writers, only 0.01% of academic writers can make any money, or can make a substantial living off their work.
So I take a view of this that every author has a business model around their work. And when it comes to professors or academics who are writing books, usually that's, you're getting paid a salary by the university, and the book is not meant to be the mainline income. Other authors I deal with, the business model, in fact, is majority of revenue is going to come from book sales. The honest truth, though, regardless of what type of author you are, it's very, very few people who make a living off book sales alone. There's almost always some other avenue that's, helping you put food on the table. That could be a rich spouse. It could be a day job, a teaching job. It could be patronage, grants. It could be, if you're an entrepreneurial sort, it could be like a Substack newsletter. So there are lots, and my book, speaks to all of the different revenue streams that authors can have. So it's almost, I think it's largely true. You're probably not going to make a living off publishing books unless you're really keyed into the zeitgeist and you can, spark the popular imagination with your book. Sapiens might be probably the best example I can think of at the moment. So yeah, I don't think that means, though, you shouldn't support your book or you shouldn't try to sell it because it's not going to matter in the end. I think that there are other ways, like if your book, even if it doesn't sell many copies, it can have a lot of influence and it can bring you a lot of opportunities that then lead to income, whether that's through speaking, consulting, or certain forms of, I call it patronage as a catch-all for where people just want to support your work because they're very excited by what you're doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I see a trend where it's like academics write because they have to in order to get career promotion. I see a lot of business leaders who are writing because they understand that the value of their image and brand, where I think academics kind of miss that point of like, okay, what is a book published in with a reputable publisher? What does that do to the way I'm perceived in my field and beyond? And I wonder if there's, some of that business oriented thinking, which might, which could be beneficial in this context.
Right. I think you used the word brand. And I know that's even for like creative writers, people who are doing novels and memoirs, that tends to be a dirty word, and like you're somehow selling out if you're trying to brand yourself, or there's all this baggage connected to brand and also marketing. And it's unfortunate because a lot of smarmy people we don't want to listen to, or talking about building your brand and spouting a lot of nonsense. But ultimately, having a brand is, I try to tell people, it's just about the expectation you're forming in people for what you do or what you deliver, the sorts of work you're involved in. It's, if I say Stephen King, you're probably going to say horror. Or if I mention some really well-known academic in your field, people are going to come up with maybe their key contribution or specialty. So that's all we really mean by, well, that's all I mean by brand, is being very consistent in telling people what you stand for.
Yeah. And I think maybe one of the important points is not waiting until you have the big launch to do that, right? Because Correct. If that's the first time people have ever heard of you is when you're launching, well, then you don't really have an existing, maybe reputation is a word that like we could, as academics, could feel more comfortable with. It's sure. Like, well, if we don't have it, if we're coming from nowhere and we don't have an existing reputation and we're not involved in the conversation, we're not engaging in dialogue, and that's beyond just in the theoretical sense of an academic article, but actually being, active in whatever fora it is that we are, then we shouldn't be shocked if the first time we post is about our book and it doesn't get a big, reception, or it doesn't right. get a strong reception. I want to turn our focus for a second to how we conduct ourselves as authors vis-a-vis the publishers themselves, right? So you mentioned, and rightly so, that publishing is it's a business, right? So, but I think as academics, we sort of assume that whatever the publishers, as a general whole, whatever the publishers are offering us, let's say we do get a publisher interested, and that itself is a big enough, sometimes a Herculean challenge, that we're so excited just to have the contract that we don't even look at the details of the contract. Who has the rights to translation, who's going to be paying for all the, sort of line items. Are they going to be covering proofreading? Those are just kind of a few examples that I've come across. And I'm curious, to hear from you about, should we be looking at it in that way of like, let's just be thankful for what we have? Or should we see this as like the beginning and openings of a negotiation that we should be conducting vis-a-vis the publisher to better our position, both short-term in terms of actually getting the book published, but also long-term in terms of, royalties or anything else, any other credit that might come along with the book?
Every contract should be seen as a negotiation. Now, the truth may be the publisher, it may not be particularly willing to negotiate, or there may be certain business practices at that publisher, and there's certain things that they will not change. But almost every publishing contract has some wiggle room. It's just figuring out where it is. And if you care about the places where there are wiggle room. So if you have an agent, and we might talk about this later, one of the great benefits of having an agent is that they typically have some knowledge or insight into how that publisher operates and the things that they will negotiate or won't, and where to apply the pressure. And so they just, because of their years of experience or exposure to that publisher's contracts, they have a really good running start. And they know what's within reason or within norms for the industry or that publisher. If you don't have the benefit of an agent, I would suggest potentially becoming a member of the Authors Guild, because every member gets free access to their legal department that will take a look at the contract and at least tell you if there's anything in there that's really taking advantage of you. Any red flags, things that are rights grabs that are not standard in the industry. Now, that aside, I think on your own, if you're prepared to do some reading and research into book contracts, and there are some good guides out there, Kirsch's is the standard. If you go to Amazon or wherever and look up Kirsch's book contracts, you're going to find kind of the guide that agents typically have on their shelf. And it's really not hard to understand some of the basic components of a book contract. Obviously, there's usually some sort of advance and royalties clause, and you're probably not going to get much of an advance from a university press, but you can always negotiate better royalties. And there are escalators in those royalties, meaning after you reach certain milestones, the royalty gets bumped up. So you should always be looking at, can you get those escalators more favorable to you? Can you increase the royalty percentage? Because typically once you earn out as the author, once you earn out that advance, if you receive one, the publisher has already earned their profit. So they should be willing to give you more at that point on the royalty side because their expenses are all covered, presumably. And then there are other rights that you might be able to keep with you, but this is where you have to look at the publisher's place in the market and what they typically do and what they're typically known for. So if you're with a press that often sells translation rights or is known for always being in this market or that market, you may want to let them retain those rights if they're, unless they demand them, so that they can do what they do best. But also on the flip side, there's probably no university publisher that should be keeping like TV and movie rights, or merchandising rights or theme park rights, if you're J.K. Rowling. So, those are the things that even if they might not be of much value to anyone, it's just standard procedure. Hold them for yourself just in case. There's certainly a lot more that we could discuss on the contract side, but I think the big thing to remember is that, yes, it's negotiable. And if you don't understand what's in it, ask your editor what it means and just because this is what it all comes back to. If there's a disagreement, even if your editor waves their hands and say, oh, that never happens, or that doesn't matter, let me assure you, it does matter. It's in the contract, and the contract is for bad times, not for good times. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I'm always surprised by how few, of our clients who come to us for help with translation, if they've already had their book published, I ask them, well, do you have the rights to the translation? And most of them say, I don't know, that's not something that we look at closely in the contract, but it may be worth taking a closer look at because, definitely if it's published in a language other than English and you want to translate it to English, that can be quite common and necessary. So I definitely recommend that people think about that. In terms of theme park rights, I am looking forward to taking the Sapiens ride next time I go to Disney. We'll see if that's out yet. I wouldn't be shocked if there was such a thing, but who knows? But let's not undersell ourselves. Maybe we never know. What's going to become a hit. So I do want to push back a little bit and sort of ask you about. You mentioned agents, and maybe you can talk about the role of an agent, but I specifically want to contextualize and frame it within the world of academic publishing, because in my experience, there aren't too many agents that are, kind of want to focus in on this niche, probably because the financial upside is not, not the lucrative upside is probably not there in most cases. Have you seen academics who do use agents? What kind of books are they writing, and how would that work?
Absolutely. There are agents who represent professors who love and look for authors with academic backgrounds if they can write for a general audience, or if their book is destined for one of the top university presses that are known for paying better advances. I think Princeton University Press is one of those that, even because of that antitrust trial that's been going on, this has come up in conversation that editors at the big houses sometimes don't even recognize that their competitors are university presses. And one of them almost lost a book to Princeton University Press because they were willing to go up to like $250,000 for an advance. So I think sometimes, we automatically discount that there could be value associated with the university press contract and not enough money to interest an agent, but that's not the case. Obviously, every book is different, and we're talking about books that likely have some potential in the general market. But there's still even some agents, even if the advance is quite low, they might be willing to work with you because they see that you've got probably more than one book in you, or maybe they're very invested in the issues that you're writing about, and they just, there are people too with their, that are willing to sometimes set aside money because they really believe in the project.
Now, you mentioned, you said, I didn't really get to grill you on this, but before we went live, you said something to me which really, struck my curiosity. And I apologize if I'm misquoting here, but something about how academic authors actually may have a better chance at writing a breakthrough book, and by breakthrough book we mean a book that really reaches broad audiences, than a typical author without an academic background. And I'm curious, kind of, for you to expand upon that and talk about kind of how you were thinking about that and why you think that's so.
Well, first of all, I'm making some assumption here that most of our audience here is writing nonfiction, and there's more nonfiction published than fiction. I think it's much harder to break out in fiction. It tends to be, I hesitate to say crapshoot, but it's just really, really subjective. But with the nonfiction, it's much easier to market. So much easier to market, whether you're the publisher or the author. And if you're a professor with expertise and engagement or knowledge of the field and who wields influence and where people talk about your subject matter, or if you did extensive research of any kind, I mean, this is really powerful from a marketing and promotion perspective. And it also, I find that professors will have their finger on the zeitgeist in a way that maybe other people don't. They see things happening. They have powers, of foresight, or they have interesting visions. They see the world differently in ways that can be very compelling. I think sometimes where the trouble enters into the picture is either the writing or the structure of the book is maybe too technical or too academic or not as easy for a general reader to follow. And so hopefully editing can take care of that, or just shifting in a certain way can make the book very exciting to the general market. So usually if you're working with a press that's shooting for that, they're going to help you do that, or or maybe you'll work with a freelancer who can help you realize the fullest potential of the work.
Got it. So I think it might be too much beyond our purview today to start delving into all the different parts of the book and how we can adapt them and make a publisher interested in our book. But maybe we could just start with something very modest, and that's the proposal, or even the query letter. And I think this is something that we see a lot. In fact, we see it so much that we turned it into a service that we offer in helping people with their proposals. But what are some of the most common issues that you see with proposals that come in, and what should a ideal proposal or query letter to an editor, what should that look like? How should we be forming it in a manner where it's actually going to jump off the page for the editor? Obviously, every editor has their own interests and their own, and there's a subjectivity there. But how do we mix? Maybe the way I want to phrase my question is, how do we sort of integrate the academic side and show that we're not quacks and we know what we're talking about, and on the flip side, make it be interesting and not too technical, so that the acquisitions editor actually gets excited about it and doesn't say, I don't know what this scholar is doing.
I would say the biggest mistake I see across the board, but is a particular Achilles heel for academics, is explaining the book, or explaining the content, or explaining the subject and getting really into the weeds, rather than selling the book. Why this book? That's the question you want to be primarily focused on in the query and the proposal. Why this book now? Why should it be me? Why is this the right time for me as an authority to be writing this? What's going to excite people about this at this moment in time? So there needs to be some element of either timeliness, novelty, fresh perspective, turning something on its head, so that we don't feel like, well, why this book now? We have to be able to satisfyingly answer that question. It can't just be, the book can't feel like a result of mere curiosity. It has to somehow feel relevant for the time that we're in. There's actually a really good piece out there, maybe, before the session is end, I can Google and find the link, is by a former agent who's now an editor at HarperCollins. And he talks about really great nonfiction books as having a switch, where you thought you and maybe most of the general public thought a certain way about an issue or topic. And then there was this something that totally changed your mind about it. I'll use a business example. It's not a very academic example, but I think the title of the book is something like Never Eat Lunch Alone. And the whole book rests on this idea that you should not eat lunch alone because it's really important to your career to engage with other people and to speak with other people regularly rather than, isolating yourself at your desk. So now it may sound like you're giving everything away maybe by putting it right in the title and that you could explain that concept in a chapter or less. But the book, has other things to offer, but it essentially builds off that switch. And so sometimes academics in particular might find this reductive or too simplistic, but I think just thinking that through can maybe lead you to something in the query proposal, at least as a pitch or a way to get started, that helps surprise, delight, make people ask questions, present attention. These are all things that I try to use as prompts to help people find what's going to be effective in their proposal.
Yeah, it reminds me of the way we marketed this event, which is, can you make money in selling your academic book? Which is like, well, of course not, right? But but maybe that's not true. And I didn't do years of research, so I can't tell you, that I can't base it on that. But I think that's really interesting what you're saying. I'm like imagining in my head as you're speaking, what would that book, if it was like a dry academic article, what would be the title of that article? Like, it would be like, the longitudinal study of eating habits on, career and work, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great as well. But I don't think that book would have sold, half as many copies as Don't Eat Lunch Alone. And it's the same book, the same research, the same ideas. So, I guess it's sort of how we package them. And what's interesting is, and I'm curious to hear from you about this, is also like, maybe we're so sort of in the weeds that we're not even the best people to understand or realize our own novelty and our own contribution. Because it's like, well, this is what I live. Whereas someone from the outside may take a look and say, oh, I never thought about the world this way, and you made me think about it. So maybe it's a matter of actually sharing with some close colleagues to get their feedback.
I totally agree. Another way to think about it is if you're at a cocktail party with people who are not at all in your field, and you have to explain to them what you're working on or your research, what do you do? How do you do that in a way that makes their eyes light up? That's what you're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I want to circle back around. We've sort of touched upon social media a few times and never talked about it directly. I'm curious whether in your experience in the last few years, you've seen that having an active social media presence, while not being the end all be all, actually may influence a publisher's decision about whether, or not to publish your book. I have heard from one or two publishers that have said this to me explicitly, like, we will look at how many Twitter followers someone has or how many LinkedIn followers. I get the feeling there are more that haven't said it, but that may actually do it. And I'm curious kind of to hear from you whether you see this as something that's common in the publishing world.
They do look, for nonfiction especially. They're always going to look, and mainly that's because it's a shortcut. The numbers are a shortcut to understanding if you're having conversations, if people seem to know you, if you wield any influence. It's a social proof or status measure of some kind. Sometimes it's not a great one, because I don't know how much this is still true, but at least when I was closer to the university, it was kind of seen as a little bit like, you're not going to go on social media and be talking about your research with other people. You're not going to be self-promoting in that way, is looked down on. And, there may still be kind of a stigma attached to that. I don't know. But, obviously in commercial publishing, there is no stigma. This is part of what you're expected to do, is have conversations in your community. So even though social is this nice shortcut for trying to figure that out, publishers do respond to other signals, which can take a lot of shapes and sizes, not least of which is the university that you're affiliated with, the colleagues that you know who will endorse your book. If you happen to do anything that's like an email newsletter or a podcast or any sort of column or something that shows that you're regularly writing and contributing to the community, this is very powerful. There was one client I worked with years ago who he didn't have much of an online platform to speak of, but he knew a lot of people at significant publications in his wonkish circle. And they weren't even really what I would call general interest publications. They were for real policy wonks. But this matters, because often word of mouth spreads in these really tight, small circles, and then it goes out. I'm wondering, this has been a while ago, the Piketty book on capital, that had the discussion about that had to have started in very small academic circles. And then I think it exploded out from there. So, and another thing that he knew important people at certain academic centers. He also knew the head of like PR or publicity at his university who had, connections to the media and was able to get professors placed, in certain outlets. So all of that can be part of your arsenal, and it has to be expressed effectively to work in your book proposal. But I think a lot of people just don't take the time to do that or think through the assets that are, as I said, in your own backyard.
Got it. No, I think that once we expand our definition of what it is, what an audience means and like how we can spread it. I made this mistake when I first started my business, which is like, okay, let me just spam my friends and family and I'm sure they'll love getting stuff about my business. Turns out they don't. And they actually don't want to hear about it. Yet someone who maybe has only met me once before, but I'm giving something of value to their profession, to their career, so all of a sudden it's like, oh, they are very interested, right? So it's not a matter of size necessarily as much as it is how much you focus on, who exactly the audience is. Now, what other? So I'm curious if you have, if I'm putting you on the spot, then feel free to tell me as much. But can you think of any specific stories over your career where there's been an author who's just come out with like an out of the box sort of, strategy or creative way of, once their book was out, getting it out there, marketing it, hustling. I think you're right that authors probably understand nowadays that they can't just rely on the publisher, but that doesn't necessarily mean they know exactly what it is to do. So you mentioned before, some really interesting ways of going about it, but I'm curious if there is anyone who really used a creative sort of strategy that you could share with us.
One author that I worked with recently, her book came out last fall. It's not an academic book, but it's kind of on the borders. It's Poe for Your Problems. So it's a bit of inspired self-help that's also kind of acts as a lighthearted Poe biography. Okay. And she, in fact, researched it partly by reading all of the academic texts on Poe, and also doing some interviews with a Poe expert at the University of Virginia. And she has no academic standing.
Edgar Allan Poe? Is that
Edgar Allan Poe, yeah.
All right. I'm a Baltimorean, so I should know this, but I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So she actually started out proposing the book as something much more serious, which publishers were like, could you lighten this up? And she did. She was very willing to go where they led her. And so it became what it is today, which is this more self-helpy title. But she, like I said, she didn't have any standing to be writing this book in particular, just a lot of research and passion for it. And so what she did for marketing and promotion was to look at anything and everything connected with Poe. So other people with Poe platforms. So like the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, they reach a good number of people by being a museum and having events and having social media and a newsletter, and they reach lots of Poe fans. And so she actually partnered with them on a launch event. Her book is stocked in their store. And, every time they sent out an email, prior to her book launching, they were announcing her book and because of her event. And she did the same thing, with various Edgar Allan Poe organizations and societies, which have Facebook pages. Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, even though he's dead, has a social media presence. So she essentially borrowed that for herself. So I think the larger takeaway here for anyone is that if you can find, like, if you don't have an online platform yourself, that's all right. Find those who do, and then find an honest and authentic way to borrow it for yourself.
Got it. And you mentioned before about an agent, but maybe now that we're kind of moved on and talking about like post, production, can you talk a little bit about a publicist? Is that something that you'd recommend, scholars here look into? If so, what should we be looking out for, and how can they help in this process?
So just to be clear, an agent will not help you for the most part with marketing, promotion, and publicity. If they do, they're going the extra mile, but most aren't going to assist. They can tell you what to expect from the publisher, and they might give you some advice, sometimes bad advice, frankly. So I don't look in their direction, although they might refer you to publicists. Hiring a publicist can be very expensive. So like you're usually looking at a minimum outlay. If you want a campaign, a minimum outlay of like $10,000 to $15,000. And usually your advance isn't even going to be half of that. So you have to do it with an eye towards investing in yourself and in your career and in raising your profile for this book's message, and having some hope that it will have a return, not in the form of book sales, but in just a raised profile that's going to benefit your next book, or help you get speaking engagements, or make you more visible to media or journalists who you'll then have relationships with for years and years to come.
Yeah. And I think that there's some positive, sort of it rubs off in other fields as well. I know that Princeton, you mentioned Princeton before, so I know Princeton started a speakers bureau internally as well, which I think could be really beneficial to authors, and understanding that, the publishers are going to give you kind of maybe some best practices for how to get it out there, but it's going to be up to you to kind of, push that and drive that forward, and figure out if there's someone that can help you do it, or if you prefer to do that yourself. All right. Well, Jane, I have a lot more to pick your brain about, but I see that we're 10 minutes until we're supposed to be finished here. So I want to hit the pause button, and thank you so far. Don't go anywhere, because we're going to be doing some Q&A here momentarily. But I do want, before we go ahead and do that, just to quickly share with folks the upcoming events that we're going to be having over the next few months. In fact, you're used to one event per month. We actually have 2 events this month, which we're really looking forward to. First, on Wednesday, September 14th, so that's in 2 weeks, this is a new monthly event. I don't know if that's what you want to call it. Basically, it is a open forum for anyone to ask any publishing questions that they may have. I will be co-hosting it together with Garrett from Research Square. So please do join us. If there are questions that you've been embarrassed to ask, or you've never had a real answer to, this is your opportunity to come and ask us. We'll tell us what we know. Can't promise what we don't know. But the first month, we're going to be talking about peer review. So that's going to be the theme. You can submit your questions ahead of time. So feel free to go ahead and sign up for that. At the end of the month, so Jane Jones is going to be with us to talk about ditching negativity and transforming your relationship with writing. And this is really going to get into the more, I guess I would call, emotional side of writing, dealing with writer's block. And she's really one of the best out there. So I encourage you to come and check her out as well. So please do join us for those events. What lines do we have? Yes. And then in October, we'll have this up for registration as of tomorrow, hopefully. The editor-in-chief of the Lancet Global Health, Zoe Mullen, is going to come to talk about how journals, if we're making a sharp turn here from books to journals, how major journals decide what kind of research gets published, looking ahead and identifying trends so that you can make sure that what you're writing about is on trend and is of interest to not just to you, but also to important publications. So kind of be on track with major journals. So go back on. So we'll send a link in the email recording to sign up for that as well. If anyone wants to be in touch with myself or with Jane, Here is the follow-up screen. You can check out Jane's work on Jane's website. I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to follow her on Twitter and LinkedIn. Yeah, Jane, is that the best way to? Okay. Yeah, she's got an awesome Twitter account, which is super active. If you want to see how Twitter done right, definitely check out Jane's account. Check out her book at the University of Chicago Press and the website. If you have any questions for me, feel free to be in touch. So that takes us to our Q&A. We're going to try to do this again like we did last time, which went quite well. So is anyone here who has asked a question, or anyone who has not yet? Would anyone like to ask their own question? I always like hearing people's voices instead of me just laboring on and asking someone else's questions. So Russell, Michael, Ralph, any of you want to sort of take the plunge? Michael, go for it. Just don't forget to unmute yourself before you do.
Okay, hi, I'm Michael Nutkevich from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'm going to be publishing with a small publisher who tends to not go to very many conferences with books. Is there value in my strategically deciding which conferences to go, even though I can't carry books for display, because it can get very expensive going from conference to conference? But what's the value of actually attending conferences without your book?
I think the big advantage is seeing and being seen, and perhaps meeting people who can help spread the word for you. Even though you might not be carrying around your book, I would highly recommend having in business cards with your book cover on one side, maybe a QR code on the other that will take them to the publisher's page or wherever you want them to go, or have just a little bit of information about the book and who you are. So I think for me, it's a relationship building thing. So you would, before even going to the conference, you would want to look at who's speaking or who's featured, who's going to be exhibiting. Are there people or institutions or organizations you want to meet? Are there potential partnerships? Are there media and publicity opportunities? And then make your decision based on, okay, how many potential leads do I have here that could be really instrumental in helping my book get seen?
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Ralph, Russell, or anyone else, feel free to just unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask.
Well, the question was asked by somebody else, but I will ask it too. How do you find an agent?
So in my mind, the best way to go about this is to go to a site called Publishers Marketplace, and I'll put the link right here into the chat. It does cost some money. I believe it's $25 a month, but it's worth every penny. So it's essentially, well, it's a lot of things, but what I'm suggesting you use it for is its deals database, which tracks publishing deals reported by agents and publishers. And the reason I suggest this particular resource rather than some others that you might have heard around the writing community is that if you want an agent, it's primarily agented deals. And so you could, what I would do is go into the deals database, have it search for just nonfiction deals so that you don't get all the fiction mixed in there. And then type in the word university as a keyword so that you bring up the university presses. And then you can see which agent sold those books. Another way you can do it is look for the word professor or PhD or doctor. But usually the authors are identified in these deal announcements. If they're a professor, it almost always says which university and that they're a professor. So that's also a really, it's a good shortcut for figuring out quickly who's representing professors and who's selling to university presses.
Thanks, Jen. So Russell's got his mic muted, but he asked me to ask on his behalf. Are there major differences between the scholars who maybe already have a tenure position and those who don't, or maybe junior versus more senior scholars, or scholars who, you know, have published a few books versus those who haven't? Or is it kind of, you know, what we've said so far really applies across the board?
Like, would that apply to consideration by a publisher or agent if you're tenured or not? Or
yeah,
They don't really care that much. To them, it's really about, do we think this book has legs in the market? I mean, obviously they want to see that you're credible and that you're authority, but they don't base that on tenure or titles. They're really more looking at reputation and engagement in the community.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as well. The one exception is that if you just send them along your dissertation, don't be surprised when you get a rejection letter. You can't just, and we won't have time to talk about this today, but obviously a dissertation, you know, a book is a lot more than just taking your dissertation, copying and pasting and sending it off to the publisher. So make sure that that's, you know, you take that seriously. I think we've got time for one more question before we're going to log off here today. All right. If not, then Jane, you know.
Oh, I have a question.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Andrea. Yes, please.
I actually had two questions, Jane. Can you get involved in the design of your cover, and how does that work? If you pay somebody to photograph an image, does that person have a right to royalties, or how does that work?
So the amount of input you have on the cover is dictated by the contract. So if it's something where you want to play a strong role in that, you need to negotiate it. I do find that university presses are generally more open to the author's involvement, but if you're working with a commercial house, they want you to stay far away. Although it's called consulting in the contract if they're willing to at least run it by you before their final decision, but it can be very hard to get them to change direction unless you can express from a market perspective why their cover isn't doing the job. Now, assuming you do get to put your oar in and play a role in the cover design, if you're going to be giving them an image of any kind, yes, you'll need some sort of permissions release or the rights to use it. And this just varies from image to image, from situation to situation. So, you know, if a photographer is taking a picture of an image, usually they just assign you the rights to that image to use it however you need to use it, but it shouldn't be a big deal. You know, the publisher themselves should be able to give you a release form that would be signed that would give them the rights needed.
Yeah. Though I will say I've come across cases where they're historical images, and that can become a real doozy to try and get rights on some of those. You know, yeah. All right, brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. This has been really helpful and informative, and you know, I think we've all really learned a lot over the last hour. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today. Yeah, and I'm just going to encourage everyone to check out Jane's website because it's really chock full of really helpful information that I think will you know, help you avoid a lot of sort of the repetitive issues that authors have, and maybe give you a perspective which will put you ahead of the curve. So Jane, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Great. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.